Sarah Trigg is a painter, a photographer, a writer, and I'm very pleased to say a member of our faculty. Her paintings have been exhibited widely in New York and across the United States, including at the Neuberger Museum of Art in Purchase, New York, not far from here, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, even closer, and the Weatherspoon Art Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. Her editorial photography, the photography she does for magazines, has been featured in Art and Auction, artinfo.com, and Modern Painters, where she's a contributing photographer and writer, and she's taken some amazing portraits of artists in those magazines. Your photograph of Laurel Nakadati is really, I guess you took several of them, but they're really astonishing. Since 2009, Sarah's been working on the Gold Miner Project, in which she observes the practices of artists as an anthropologist might, focusing on the curiosities she finds in their studios, but not on their art practices per se, so the stuff that surrounds their artwork. To date, she has surveyed the collected objects, makeshift tools, habitats, rituals, residue, and mascots, and those are her terms, of over 200 artists. What an interesting thing to do as an artist, to turn your attention to the work of other artists. Her recent book, Studio Life, right here, was published in 2013 by Princeton University Press. The full title is Studio Life: Rituals, Collections, Tools, and Observations on Artistic Practice. It collects the writings and conversations that grew out of her engagements with 100 of the artists that participated in the Gold Miner Project. Please help me in welcoming Sarah Trigg.
Thanks, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight, to see a lot of familiar faces back. Last spring, I taught a course with Jim Clark, and we're teaching it again as elective this year, field work, visiting artists in their studios. And therefore, I thought it would make the most sense to focus on my book project, since really related to the course. And I hope that the presentation will give you a sense of the breadth of the project and the variety. In 1 hour, it's hard to put everything in to give you, the full scope, but I encourage you to, I put in a request through the library for them to get the book. And I also have, at the end of the lecture, or the presentation, I'll give you a discount if you want to purchase it through the publisher, which is Princeton Architectural Press, not Princeton University, but it's started in Princeton. It's actually in New York, so it's kind of a bit of a misnomer, but it's a great publisher. So I thought I would start by, I'll present the concepts of the book, and a little bit of my painting practice will come up in discussing how the ideas for the project came about. And towards the end, I'll follow up with how my practice is now and how the project transformed my studio practice a bit. And then I'll open up for questions at the end. So the project started for me in 2009. I had been in New York for quite a while, and I had just moved out of a studio that I had been in for 10 years. And I was about to move again into another studio. And so I was naturally making some observations about my own studio practice, and would jot things down from time to time in my sketchbook, and not really planning to use them for anything. They were just sort of observations I was making. And I began to wonder, like, gosh, what are these kind of quirky, what are the equivalents in other artist studios? Because I know they have them. And these sort of threads of ideas started to come together into one much larger idea, and that was as Mark mentioned before, what if to look at an artist's practice through a more anthropological lens instead of focusing so much on the actual art itself or the personality or background of the artist, to look at some of the things in their daily life in the studio. And furthermore, I had this sort of vision of like, what if we were like, planet Earth was hit by a giant meteor today and we were covered in cosmic dust for the next billion years, and some future version of an anthropologist came and stumbled upon artist dwellings. What would they think about what we were doing? Why was it different from everything else around them, or what were they making and what use was it? And all these sort of questions that come up in the art world. These are questions that we're asking ourselves today, right? So I set out, and the more I had this idea, the more research I did, I realized that there really wasn't any proper documentation of this, and the only thing that I could really find that was similar to it was down in Houston at the Menil Collection. They have, if you ever get down there, there's a exhibition that was put together by the anthropologist Edmund Snow Carpenter of the objects and things from other cultures, oftentimes tribal cultures, of things that influenced them. But I couldn't really find anything else, and so I felt really strongly that this thing needed to come to life. And I also realized that I had these skills from my various day jobs throughout the years in publishing as a photo editor and art director and various things in publishing, that I had sort of the skill set necessary to put this thing together, and it wasn't intimidating for me to put a book together. And the more I talked about it with other artists, they were so enthusiastic about it. It really made me quite passionate about starting this project. So the 6 categories are mascots, collected objects, rituals, makeshift tools, residue, and habitat. And basically, this just kind of helped start the conversation going when I would meet with artists because sometimes I'd arrive and they'd be like, well, I don't really have anything, but you're welcome to look around and shoot whatever you want, But sure enough, by the time we got through this list, they would come up with some incredible gem in their studio that was usually the weirdest thing. And so it helped to shift the focus away from the artwork and onto these other curiosities. So I thought I would go through, to give you a sense of the book, I would go through each category and give you a few classic examples. This was the mascot my mascot that influenced this entire category, and it was a sculptural sketch that never really I never really used it for anything, and it sort of floated around my studio, whichever studio I was in, like a plant or a pet or something, and it just sort of embodied the spirit of my studio. And unfortunately, its top half fell through the window to the left of this frame, so he's no longer with us, but he's with me in spirit. And actually, strangely enough, my work kind of looks more similar to this today than it did back then. I wasn't really doing sculpture back then. But the studio, the practice that by far had the most influential mascot was that of Nick Cave, who's actually, you guys might know his work. He did a performance at Grand Central Terminal, I think it was last spring, through Creative Time. He's giving a talk, he's having a conversation with Nato Thompson on September 12th at the New York Public Library. That might be interesting to check out. At any rate, this was a figurine that stands about 4 feet tall that he encountered when he was, he hadn't made it big yet. He was still, very much a struggling artist, and he saw it at a flea market, and he was it's wrapped wrapped in bubble wrap. We decided not to disturb it from its mummified state. And he was so taken with it when he saw it that he had to sit on the curb and collect himself because he just had to have this thing, and he couldn't buy it, and he finally convinced the guy who was selling it to give it to him on a layaway plan. And he said that the shape of the head, the sort of square shape and the stance were the thing that really struck him about this figurine. And as you can see, he's kind of been riffing on this, the spirit of this sort of mascot throughout his work. And then another mascot was at the studio of Deb Socolow in Chicago. Nick Cave was also in Chicago. Rocky is her mascot. And unfortunately, this photo is not in the book because I made the mistake of contacting Sylvester Stallone, who owns the rights to Rocky, apparently. And he didn't really like the idea of Rocky being an artist mascot, so it didn't fly so well. But at any rate, I can show it to you. And Deb, Rocky to her embodies the emerging artist, the struggling emerging artist, and she makes these elaborate flow charts. This one is a sort of a deconstruction of the movie Rocky, of the screenplay, and she inserted herself as a character in the movie, and the title is Rocky, Adrian, and Me. This is a detail. I forget what color she is, but I suspect she's red. And then collected objects was a far larger, broader category. In my studio, I obsessively, I don't do it anymore, but I used to sort of obsessively collect imagery of the surface of the earth. They were collections that I did. These are some examples. I was obsessed with mines for a while, but this is a painting from 2007 of mine, and I would collect, I would select a calendar date in the past 10 years, and then would collect imagery that was related to the landscape-related events reported in the news for that day, and then compress them into an image, sort of neo-Northern European Renaissance-looking surrealist thing. This is another one. And this is, to give you an idea of how much I collect. These are all filled with images, these binders. And then my work sort of naturally, by working with so much imagery, it sort of naturally collapsed into abstraction. And this was the types of paintings I was doing just before I started the project. And so, as I was working, the project, in total, I think I was shooting and documenting for about 3 years. And throughout those years, the name that came up time and time again was Trenton Doyle Hancock. He has a warehouse filled with various collections of stuff, and he is down in Houston, and as Mark mentioned before, I'm a contributing editor for Modern Painters, which came about through this project, because it was similar. I was able to contribute to one of their columns, and it really facilitated my project quite a bit because I was able to shoot and write in nearly all the cities I visited. So for Trent, I pitched pretty much just to visit him, and went down to Houston. And as you can see in the photo, he has an enormous warehouse filled with stuff. These were all thrift store paintings. Needle points, which I think he actually may have sold this collection to someone else. But and then he also at his home. In the back, he had an apartment above the garage, and it was filled wall to wall with various different toys. And specifically in the kitchen was the ride-ons, and within the ride-ons, he has a collection of food food ride-ons. You can Godzilla, My Pretty Pony. This is just skimming the surface of the various, I mean, he had just endless amount of various toys. And so these all, by collecting all these toys, it kind of gives him the, sort of the vocabulary to, he invented his own storytelling in his work. He invented these characters called the Mounds, which are half plant, half human, and various other characters. Torpedo Boy, which is more self-referential, and then Frogman was a guy I spotted in his studio that I shot. And he also brought up that by studying toys, it also influenced his sense of color theory as well. And then onward to, I needed a behavioral category. So this was and Rituals kind of covered all of that. This is at the studio of Adam Janes in Los Angeles. And he hangs upside down to take a break. And at the studio of Lauren Luloff in Brooklyn, a painter, she has a superstition of keeping this light on 24/7 because the one time she turned it off, her studio was broken into. So she dubs this the protector of the studio. And then by far the practice that was the most infused with ritual was that of Jen DeNike. She works in photography, video, and also performance. You're looking at her daily journal of some of her witchcraft rituals and possibly other types of rituals. I'm not sure to the full extent. These are just notes to herself. And these are some of the oils that she used in those rituals. And so some of these rituals are determining a lot of her decision-making in her work. And she collaborated with a choreographer for a performance at MoMA a few years back. And one of the rituals for the ballerinas that she was working with is that they would, they give away their shoes at the end and will autograph them. The shoe at the far right was a slipper that Jen would carry with her when because sometimes our studio isn't in a studio in four walls. It's like, she has to travel a lot. She might be working on a totally different project and suddenly have to shift her focus. And so she would hold this slipper to just kind of, channel herself and be able to think just about the project at hand. And this was my makeshift tool that inspired the makeshift tool category. It's a pretty simple machine. But I work in acrylic, so I need water wherever I go, and I had a studio where going to the slop sink was kind of a pain. And so I cut out the back of this jug, and that way I could keep on refilling it and it had sort of like a portable sink wherever I went. And I thought, God, I wonder what the other tools are that other artists make, because we're constantly having to invent things, sometimes to make, the art that we're making has never existed before, so we need to come up with some kind of invention to make it. And that was the case at Gordon Terry's studio in Red Hook. This was probably the most elaborate tool I encountered, and there had been several variations prior to this. Those red cylinders on each corner are hydraulic jacks, and it basically allows him to tip each corner independent of the other, kind of like a pimped up car. And in that way, on the surface, he can pour I think he mostly works in acrylic, and he can tip it around without touching it with his hands or any tools, and it's just moving with gravity. It makes these sort of psychedelic looking specimens. And then so that was pretty elaborate, but also, sometimes things were super simple. This is on the book cover, The Brush of Wendy White. She gives her brushes custom-made haircuts to get the effect that she wants. And I thought it was interesting that it sort of took on the shape of some of her canvases, which are often irregularly shaped, or sometimes she'll group a couple canvases together. And then residue, this is the floor of Jackie Battenfield, a painter in Brooklyn. You know, the first thing probably that comes to mind when you think of residue in artistic practice is the, you know, dripping from paints and painting and, you know, sculptural residue and things like that. But I also wanted to, you know, I got to thinking, well, what's the residue from a photographic process or from video or performance? And this was at the studio of Barbara Kasten in Chicago, a phenomenal photographer, if you don't know her work. And she does these sort of elaborate setups and then photographs them. They end up relating to constructivist painting. And these were leftover kind of relics from some props that she used for work that she shot in the 70s. And then onward to Jessie McLean's studio, who's a video artist. This was, you know, leftover notes for editing her videos and the videos that or films that she would appropriate from, and a paper edit from her process. And then a strange phenomenon that I came across by visiting 200 studios was there were several artists that would have residue, but then it would get folded back into their process, so there was never really trash per se. This was at the studio of Jedediah Caesar in LA, and he collects stuff from outside, but also, you know, and he would take in his own sort of detritus, and also, you know, this was plaster from his wife's studio. It was kind of a vortex that everything around him got pulled in to these resin castings that he made, and then he would slice them up like, you know, rock or something. And then, so a year into the project, I started with the first 5 categories I mentioned, and then a year into the project, I was at Gordon Terry, the guy with the table, and his wife, Carol Beauvais in Red Hook, and I came across this door, and I realized that my categories were, I was missing a 6th category, which was habitat, and habitat is something that I define as, I really didn't want to shoot just sort of the general look of the studio, because I felt like there's a lot of exposure for that elsewhere in art magazines, even the one that I shoot for, and I really wanted to shoot things that didn't have a place to be exposed. So that's sort of why I avoided habitat initially, but basically, so they had this vault in their studio. They thought their studio may have been a bus depot at some point, and it was locked. And they convinced the landlord to give them the combination. They tried the combination, it didn't really work. And they thought that it looked like it had been painted over so many times that possibly the paint was just holding it shut. So they torched the edges. Don't do this. But you can see down at the bottom, they torched the edges of the door to see if that might loosen the paint to open it up. That didn't work. And then they finally welded on that L bracket and cracked it open with a car jack, which what I really loved about that story, and inside it was just tax documents and rotting furs, but, and 2 of their assistants fell ill after being inside, so it's been shut ever since, but I just thought it was so funny that, you know, the concept for an artist to leave a rock unturned in their studio is just not possible. I mean, the curiosity just took over. So that once that category was in place, that opened up a whole other conversation with artists. This was at the studio of John Espinoza in LA. And in LA, everyone turns their garages into studios. They have so much more space, much to the envy of us New Yorkers. But he ripped down the drywall and encountered these really cryptic drawings behind the drywall. And at first he thought, well, maybe they're plumbing diagrams or electrical diagrams. He did a fair amount of research, couldn't find anything that synced up with it. And finally, he ended up contacting the previous owner who had been in the house for like 25 years, and they said, no, that drywall has been up the entire time. And John was so taken with these that he ended up basing a whole series off the tracings of these drawings. And this is a show that he did. So by my manuscript deadline for the book, I had documented 200 studios. And in conversation with the publisher, we decided to narrow it down to 100, which was really hard to do. I plan to, on my website, thegoldminerproject.com, I think there's about 20, well, the remaining 100 that are not in the book I plan to continue to publish on that site. I think there's about 20 there now. But inevitably, the question I get asked the most is, how did you decide, which artists would be in the book? And I knew from the beginning that I wanted it to be a survey of art making today. I really wanted to capture a wide array. So this here is, my criteria. I wanted a range in career stage, location. New York is by far, I think it's 40% New York artists. I tried to keep everything sort of in proportion to the population. So New York, second was LA. Chicago is a pretty close runner-up. I also, I was in Miami for a month through a residency at Legal Art, which is now called Cannonball, a great residency worth checking out. And then, what am I missing? San Francisco, and then a few places in between. Whenever I could, I would try to get away from, shoot elsewhere, if it were possible. I did a residency at Three Walls for Chicago, and was lucky enough to have family in LA and San Francisco. Did a fair amount of dog sitting for my aunt in LA, and that's how it kind of all came together. Artistic discipline, so painters, performance artists, people who work with public art, wanted a range in that, range in background and ethnicity, a balance in gender. The book is 50% women. And then once I was done shooting, the first thing I did when I subletted my studio for 2 years while I was working on this project, which was initially a very, very hard thing for me to do. I didn't think it would take that long to make the book, but once I did that, the project really took off because I was able to dedicate all my time to it. And at any rate, when I got back into my studio, I printed out all the examples I shot, and it came down to the strength of the examples and the what I felt was necessary for the art community at large to see. And then there was sort of a subtle narrative within the book. It starts out with it touches upon things that we hit upon early on in life, and then it goes through sort of significant phases of going out into nature, political identity, sexual identity, then towards the end, it gets a little bit more spiritual. It goes through this sort of lifetime. And I started with the door at Carol Beauvais and Gordon Terry's studio. So we kind of bust open into this, like, you know, see what's behind the door. And then it ends with John Baldessari's door, which is, I don't even know how it's like 20-foot door or something like that. And it wasn't the last studio shot, but it was close to the last, and it was kind of a good, I thought, you know, a fairy tale ending to close these big doors. I don't know if you can see it from there, but there's a peephole that's at John Baldessari's height on the right, and then normal heighted individuals are on the left. John's like, I don't know, 6'7" or something like that. So to give you an idea of the criteria, I deliberately made it so you can't really read it, but to give you an idea of just how extensive the going through all the criteria to make sure that I was getting the best survey possible. I have to, one of my rituals is I have to color code everything, so that's why all the colors are there. Yeah. So when I got back to my studio, you know, working in acrylic, all my paints had dried in their canisters. And so I began to crack them open, and it was kind of, they were kind of like 3-year-old eggshells or something as I cracked them open. And I found it interesting that the surfaces and the sculptural quality, the textures were sort of similar to the surfaces of the earth of the images that I had collected before when I had left my studio. And so I started stacking these and playing around with them. And eventually they kind of turned into what I think of as sort of like a core sample of, you know, many layers of earth. But they're mostly pure paint with a few other things mixed in. This one, I used some plaster as well, and the sort of naturally my process took on what I was talking about before with the residue. Now there's not really much residue in my studio. Anything. This was the casting for the thing that we saw previously, and that turned into a sculpture, and things just kind of keep on kicking around the studio until they build up a patina of various processes and paint and whatnot. And some of the paints hadn't dried, and with that I started pouring it out onto plastic and burlap, and I naturally started making these sort of skins, right? And suddenly I didn't need a paint support anymore. I didn't need canvas. I didn't need, they're all pure paint, mostly. A little bit of stuff mixed in here and there, but, and they hang. They have front sides and back sides. And you can see as you get closer, you know, there's, like this may have had, I don't know, 20 layers of paint slowly, you know, kind of layered on it. So you can kind of get an idea of the history as you get closer to them. That's a close up. And anything lying around, you know, like this one kind of took on some, you can see some plaster in there, but they're mostly paint. And because of this process, you know, I mix paint on the plastic and constantly layering on plastic. So there's a lot of plastic residue kicking around my studio. And so this is a close-up of one of them. So it's naturally sort of taking on, the work is taking on this more geological process, and I kind of think of this as like similar to how like a glacier might scrape across the Earth's surface. So when you lay paint on this, it will pick up, you know, several processes. These are some front and back. And then in another corner, there's a process going on where all my residue goes into this bucket, And my paint water, at the end of the day, instead of dumping it down the sink, I'll dump it into this bucket, so it's sort of slowly building up sediment. And every once in a while, I'll chip out a chunk. And you can see, I mean, none of this is planned. This is all kind of happening through, nature, if you will. I never know exactly what I'm going to get. And it's hard I shot these for this presentation, but I'm still working out exactly how I'm going to present these. It's sort of hard for me to think of these as individual works at this point, but kind of working that out. And then, any sort of scraps that are left over, I keep those, and those might be built and made into these sort of assemblages. They take on sort of, in a way, things begin to look like torsos and faces and skins. And they're quite heavy. This one is about, I don't know, like that, 3 feet maybe, and about 1/2 inch thick, all paint. So they get quite heavy. And another thing that happened, I mean, this is using canvas, but not in sort of a dependent way. When I got back into the studio, I was so divorced from the rules that I had before, and so much had changed from working on the book that I was really detached from, if I had a painting in the corner that I wasn't very fond of, or I just felt like ripping apart, or not in a negative way, but it just wanted to use it for something else, it was fair game. And so there's a lot of these sort of folded objects around that are made. I started with a piece of canvas that was from a previous painting. And these are kind of smaller pieces, any sort of wet paint on the table will get blotted up and kept. And then there's, I found a fallen tree outside of my studio, which looks so weird to me in Bushwick because we barely have any trees to begin with, much less a tree laying down like in nature. And so I hauled it into my studio and ripped the bark off, and that sort of became a painting support for these spear-like objects that are kind of instrument-like or weapon-like. And I don't have many rules, but one is that I don't want to show the industrialization of this planet. So even, if I use aluminum wire, such as in this piece, this is an earlier piece. Now they're much more, I kind of disfigure the wire a lot more, but I want everything to look like it has a sort of a different nature than here, and not to show industrialization, and also not to really show the human hand. There's no like manipulation of the clay that would show like a thumbprint or something like that. So that is it. I wanted to quickly mention that there's a mentioning of SVA in the introduction, which is by total coincidence. I finished the book before working here. I'm not going to tell you the story. You'll have to find it for yourself. But with that, I will open up to any questions. I mean, it definitely wasn't a goal of mine. I wasn't looking to, I actually was pretty happy with where my painting was before I started, and to be honest, I was terrified to take any time away from my studio. Yeah, I wasn't really looking to shake it up at all, but I'm so glad I did, because it feels, I mean, now I can see it's like something that, or it feels as though something that my work needed to do, and I mean, through the process of working on this gargantuan project, it makes me realize that, if you feel overwhelmed, in a good way, to follow something, just to trust your gut, because you can't really rationalize, if you really feel that you have the passion and determination to carry it through, maybe just, don't really analyze it too much, Also, day job skills you can use for yourself. I kind of see them, it's an interesting question because I think it's definitely, a lot of artists don't think about that, or like fluorescent paint, that's gonna go away, you know, really fast, yeah. Your work is gonna look really different. I do kind of see them as, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I sort of see the studio as like closer to like a garden now, and they're kind of, everything that you saw there could get reworked again. And I'm struggling a little bit with that question because, you know, of course, when you go to exhibit or if you work with a gallery, they're not too fond of you being like, well, it's not really done, you know, or that could change, or it might fall apart if that collector buys it, or.
And it could be a restoration nightmare.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm not really thinking about that right now, and I think it's. I mean, all work has its issues. I mean, oil has its issues as well. But it's true, and you know, acrylic hasn't been around for that long. I mean, it's only been around since the 1950s. We don't really know what it's going to do. But yeah, it's an interesting question. But yeah, I think of them, you know, yeah, they could change, you know, in 10 years. They could be different, so. It's a combination of, you know, especially when I would arrive in Miami or something, they were like, you gotta, you know, the word on the street. I mean, when I would hear a name 3 or 4 times, it was a sign that I really should go over and check out their studio. Other times I would do my own research, and I could kind of pick up on something in their work that I just got sort of a sixth sense that I was going to find something good there. And then there was a lot of surprises, you know. I found really strange stuff at unexpected places, and that was a delight. So, did I answer your question? I don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you elaborate on your surprises?
What's that?
Can you elaborate on your surprises?
Yeah. One was at the studio of Nicholas Lobo in Miami, and Nick is a very stoic guy. I love his work. He follows, it's unusual in that he really follows the culturally aberrant or the culturally obscure. To give you an example, one of his sculptures is covered in what the makeup would be of Soylent Green. And so I met with him when he had just moved into his studio. He was kind of like, oh, I don't really have that much stuff around. And we got to talking, and he was like, residue, well, I do have something left over from this like experiment for a project that never really made it to light, and I think I have some of it in my refrigerator still. And what it was he had heard this urban myth that you could make soy sauce out of human hair. And he decided to try it and poured acid onto his own, you know, shaved his hair and poured acid onto it and broke it down into its basic aminos. And sure enough, he tried it with some sushi, and it tasted like soy sauce, but a little greasier, he said. And it was so... I took a long time for me to shake that one off. I was like, wow. In fact, I can probably find a picture for you here, but I don't want to distract too much from any other questions anyone might have, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say a thing that I saw time and time again was this trust in not having to figure everything out right away, like just to act and doing, and then not to say not to analyze it, but maybe analyze it later. because sometimes, I mean, this is a belief I have, and I had it before I started this project, but now it's a much firmer belief. But I mean, creative work is, you know, it's heavily right-brained. You know, you're dealing with the subconscious a lot. It's working together with, you know, your consciousness. So sometimes, you know, you have to trust in letting go. You know, you have to trust in that maybe this other part of your brain kind of knows what it's doing if it's just left to its own devices. But I do, you know, to counteract that, something that's been really helpful for me, and also in this project, is writing. To really put into words what the heck you're trying to say, you know? And for me, going through the exercise of trying to explain, I'm not showing any artwork in the book, so, and for each artist, I would have to give, you know, a little synopsis to some people that may not have any idea, you know, what this artist, what their work looks like. I mean, there is an index in the back, but it's like, you know, to really get clear about what you're trying to say. Well, I guess there is still part of me figuring it out, but for me now, the studio is a site from which I'm extracting, you know, I'm mining from that place. And I'm actually kind of thinking of removing things from my studio that are not part of that process. It's now so much global. And you know, the books that I have in there, if they're not part of the process, they got to get out. You know, it's like this. I'm still. I haven't. You know, I'm still sort of figuring out the rules, and very much so in the exploration mode. I haven't really written about the work yet. But again, you know, it's like it's the site is like an excavation site, and I also, I guess there is a fantastical element there, in that I sort of imagine the objects that come out of it to be, you know, going back to the analogy of the meteor that hit the Earth and we're covered in cosmic dust. It's like maybe I'm excavating some otherworldly place that doesn't adhere to the rules that, I mean, you know, maybe has some of the similar elements that we have here in laws of nature, but is different. This idea of looking at things anthropologically is now coming out in the work now. I mean, you know, some of the spears, they look like makeshift tools for what we don't know. So yeah, I guess it's a way of seeing, you know, or a way of observing that's folded back into the work. And also, I mean, it's sort of impossible to look at 200 studios and not have some of their processes influence you. I mean, you know, I'll be working and I'm like, oh, that's, you know, I'm being influenced by that artist or this artist. And, you know, even if you were going to try to do exactly what they were doing, it's going to come out differently. So, but yeah, it's, I guess it's, you know, it's just a way of seeing. But yeah, I really struggled in the beginning with giving myself the permission to go off and do this thing. I mean, I wasn't sure if I was going to come back to my practice. You know, I don't know if in the future I'm going to make another book. I mean, but what it taught me was, like, you know, just whatever it is, your creative life is your creative life, and in whatever way it's going to come out, you don't know. I mean, you could be a screenwriter or whatever, you know, and whatever you're doing, it can fold into the next thing. And, you know, when I was writing the book, I was all of a sudden, I spent a summer chained to my desk writing, and all of a sudden had to be like, wow, I have to come up with some real rituals here as a writer, you know. And it's all, I mean, you might be using a different part of your brain or whatever, but it's still creative work, you know, and it's all, you know, you can, if you stay open, you can see the threads there. But to me, you know, it doesn't bother me at all if people are like, oh, she's a writer, they know me as this or they know me as that. It's like, well, that's if people see an inconsistency or that find that strange to me, it's like, I don't see it any other way, so, yeah. That's an interesting question. I don't consider myself a journalist when I'm doing the book. And even writing for Modern Painters, when I do, I usually send the text to the artist. And with the book, I sent the text to each artist for them to look at. My publisher thought I was crazy. They're like, whoa, you are just opening a whole can of worms, like this, you know. And what I found actually was that I was so thankful to share it with the artists, because frequently they would see something that I was observing or noticing, and they're like, oh, you know, by the way, I did this and that, or you might also want to mention this interesting thing, or I might have my facts incorrect, you know, and they would correct something that I was really, you know, I wanted to get it correct. So, yeah, so I didn't feel like anything was really fabricated or, you know, misrepresented. Are there any other questions? I think maybe wrap it up. Yeah?